Thank you very much. Thank you, Indu, and thank you, Kamla, for having me. It's really great to be here. Now, while I figure out my slides, I would like to ask all the participants to just drop a quick note into the chat about what you were hoping to achieve from this session. So there's nothing worse than signing up to attend something and then getting none of your questions answered. So I know we have a Q&A following, but I would just like to get a brief idea of what do you want to know from this session? What is it about this session that brought you here today and has put you on our screens? So I can do my best to ensure that what I'm talking to you about is engaging with what you really want to know. Now, I'm a real ESG passionate, so I want to make sure that I'm directing my passion towards what you actually want to hear. So while I'm pulling up my slides on the screen, please pop into the chat box what you want to get from today's session. Then, Indu, could you do me the favor and read what has been popped into the chat box?
Yeah, certainly. Well, one comment is from myself, which is some practical approaches to ESG for all kinds of organizations. And I've been, had the benefit of a discussion with you. So I think perhaps that's one of the things you might cover. But nobody else has commented as yet.
Okay, no problem. Well, we'll have a lot of Q&A at the end and we'll be able to address that. So ESG and the Great Wealth Transfer. So let's start by just understanding what is ESG and why is it important. So ESG is a framework. ESG is a lens through which you can view absolutely anything. What it is looking at is the environmental, the social, and the governance impact of what you are doing and how you are doing it. ESG has evolved and is going to continue to evolve. So how I like to view it is as a journey and not a destination. So ESG is part of an ongoing area and field that has a lot of research going into it and a lot of measuring and impact assessment going into it in order to continuously improve what it means to be a responsible business. So ESG is basically a request of businesses to consider and mitigate the negative impact that their operations may have on environment, on society, as well as their governance behaviors. So as Phil Harding, the archaeologist, once said, without environmental sustainability, economic stability and social cohesion cannot be achieved. So this is just a testament to the interdependence of these three branches. So the E and the S and the G. I like to see it as a bit of a tree with governance as the root of the tree and environmental and social best practice evolving and flourishing off the roots of solid governance. So the environmental E is one that is really better, probably the best understood of all three in the business arena. So, your carbon emissions, your use of energy, your waste practices and pollution management, how and where you invest your money and the impact of those investments on the environment are probably the most easily quantifiable measurements within an ESG framework. You then look at society or social, depending on who you ask. It could be society or social that the S stands for. And the social is about how an organization treats its employees and the community. So what is the impact that the operation of the business is having on its own employees, on its customers, on those third parties affected by what they do, be it because of the location, be it because of the reach of the operation. What is the health safety record of the operation of the company? What are its procurement practices and its supply chain practices? What commitments has it made to diversity, inclusion, social equity, furthering education in communities, et cetera, et cetera. Then we look at governance and corporate governance practices, and we tend to look at what is the diversity of that company's board, how it's managed, how it's, its external assurance practices and the transparency there, accountability, whether or not there is transparency in executive pay, remuneration, how risk is managed by the company and its leadership, as well as elements such as, for example, cybersecurity and how it keeps its customer data safe. So that's a little bit about what the E, the S, and the G are, and its importance really is that these factors have been aggregated to build a picture of what responsible business looks like. So responsible business looks like a company that considers its impact in all of these realms and actively mitigates against it. So what are the key stumbling blocks that we see in ESG? So where are the companies falling over? So you're seeing in more litigious societies like North America, you're seeing a lot of greenwashing that's pulling companies into court, where companies are saying that they're doing certain things that are environmental or responsible or sustainable or green, using all of these key buzzwords that it believes will attract consumers. And then behind the scenes, they're in fact not doing a net positive thing with what they're claiming is green. So that greenwashing is causing a lot of trouble. There's a litigation element, there's a reputational element, and this idea of marketing the good and omitting the bad is what greenwashing is referring to. So reporting and due diligence, so the accuracy and accountability of data gathering, management, and impact. So companies are also falling over on, we want to say this, but we don't want to say that, and there's an incomplete picture in reporting and disclosures that can be, in some locations, can result in a legal offense because there is regulation in that space. But in others, again, you're seeing reputational impact and losing consumer trust or public trust as a company. We then have the big data problem, which I think is one of the most interesting problems, where companies often gather a lot of data and then don't necessarily have the means to analyze or understand it all. And at law, there's a liability question attached to that. How much is a company responsible for that it should have known or could have known based on the data it gathers and holds? And how much of that should it be responsible for? So how much of that should the company be held to account for? And how much should we be telling a company they need to know based on the data that they hold? Sidelining governance is another one, and particularly in the Caribbean, you can see this a lot because there are some cultural bad habits at play in the governance realm in the Caribbean, where we almost normalize poor governance behaviors because they have been so entrenched and we've done it for so long, picking up the phone to someone to get a backdoor to get something done faster or better or more efficiently. Nepotistic practices as well, small island communities where people know each other very well and are very close can result in behaviors that can produce, ethically questionable behaviors, and that bring into question whether or not good governance is truly understood and being employed. Also things like composition of boards, diversity, as well as the sort of old notion that what gets measured gets managed. Is the company measuring what it needs to measure in order to manage what it should be managing? Cybersecurity is one that people don't tend to associate a lot with ESG, but it is actually one of the key stumbling blocks because, for example, you look at data breaches, such as there was recently one here in Trinidad where Massey's retail arm, a large supermarket chain, got hacked. And, the public trust then was sort of shaken a little bit. So where is my data? Who has it? What does Massey hold on me? And is it not safe? Are the systems that many of these companies have in place for my payment information, my personal information, etc., are they safe? That can bring into issue a lot of things on the ESG frameworks, be it the social impact or the governance impact of that company's operations. Then ongoing compliance and accountability is often a stumbling block in ESG because a lot of companies come into ESG hot and sweaty with the desire to get started and get on their ESG journeys. And then you start seeing that energy sort of wane, the resources being deployed towards the ESG strategy start to waver a little bit, and you start seeing sort of a lack of consistency and ongoing compliance and accountability. So these are just some of the key stumbling blocks that are seen, and this is globally. This is across the piece. You will see these being key stumbling areas for companies attempting to achieve an ESG strategy that they've put in place. So let's look at the next generation now and why the great wealth transfer can really bring opportunity in the area of ESG development. So the first area, of course, is the use of technology. We all have smartphones in the palm of our hands. We have information that generations before us did not have as easily accessible. this creates a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges at the same time. So, the advantages it creates are connectivity, transparency, real-time access to information. It's created accessible investment platforms as well, which has allowed much younger and less wealthy individuals to participate in the investment market because they have the information and the platform to do so. And that has, again, created a huge competitive market for brokerage firms, meaning that you more than likely now can find free access to a platform to allow you to conduct investments. There's this intentionality as well that comes with the increased information. So we know more now about the impact of what we're doing than we did previously. So previous generations may not have been as aware of what the impact of, for example, their manufacturing operation was that was based on coal. Now there is a lot more intentionality around this because the impact is understood, and it creates a sort of duality of both purpose and revenue, purpose and profit, should we say, in the investment arena. There's also the sense of impending doom. So the future, the generation following the boomers has had to endure sort of feeling both the effects as well as the added knowledge of the impacts of climate change, poverty and food insecurity as a result, increasing poverty, should I say, and food security as a result. And then we have a pandemic and a war and many other crises that have really awoken the generation to the real scale problems that need to be addressed with, and referring to the last point on the slide here, investment being a really essential tool in solving a lot of these crises. There's also this idea of the evolution of the fiduciary responsibility, where what used to just be generate return is now coupled with an impetus to do so responsibly and sustainably. Oh, there we go. So I will just leave it right there, keep it nice and brief, and allow Professor Garratt to add his piece.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And what I think we should do is go straight on to Professor Garratt, and I'll invite you to start, and then we can have more of a interactive discussion. Okay. Welcome, Professor Garratt.
Thank you. And good evening from, it's still just daylight in London, amazingly, this time of the evening as we move towards 9:30, but there we go. But first of all, I'd like to thank Peter and Kamala particularly for setting up the series. I mean, my idea of success on this series is that I now have more questions than when I started, but I think they are much better questions, and I hope other people are feeling the same there. This morning, I had one of my 2 monthly scheduled Zoom calls with two great friends, both of them very senior directors in global businesses, and they were at their most depressed I've seen them in perhaps the last 3 years. I was quite shocked. They work in different parts of the world. They are in completely different businesses, one in energy, one in finance, and they were saying that they weren't quite sure how to move ahead now. They were very puzzled by the world situation. They were very puzzled by, particularly actually, the British government's decision last week to not go ahead with creating a new agency for audit and reporting and governance. Instead, they decided to park that after years of trying to set the thing up, and to just tweak a little bit the current legislation. And they were genuinely down and puzzled. And I had a long chat with them that I thought their mindsets were still on, if you like, old corporate governance. So I'm assuming corporate governance is, as the phrase has developed over 3,500 years, how directors, people charged with giving direction to their organizations, whether they're public, private, family, state-owned enterprises, charities, or whatever, how they do two things simultaneously. One, how they drive their organization towards a healthy future, so the continuity of the healthy organization on the one hand, and on the other hand, simultaneously, ensure that it is under prudent control. And that to me is the basis of what we're trying to do in corporate governance. What I was pointing out to them is that their mindsets from the way they were talking this morning were still very much around this notion of old corporate governance. And I'm happy to say Rachel has touched on some of this just now. Their mindsets were still, although they don't agree with this, but their mindsets are still in shareholder supremacy. They were still very much around the issue of the importance of stock exchanges and particularly the issue of IPOs, etc. They were very much around the issues of how we can begin to rescue what exists. And I was saying to them, listen, this is most probably not the wisest road to take. One of them had been a very successful fund manager for quite a long period. And I was suggesting to him that maybe 90% of current fund management is really redundant now. There's very little, there's some that has to be done, but there's not the industry that's been built up around fund management, ending up in really absurdity, ending up in the notion that fund managers need to be reporting so they get quarterly bonuses, which is absolutely antithesis of what decent investment is and decent corporate governance is, as far as I am concerned. And so we were talking through these issues. And then I mentioned this Great Wealth Transfer series. I was talking through the sorts of things we've been talking about and where we think the future is going, where we think the next generation is going. And to cut a very long story short, because it went on for well over an hour, this session, we were deciding that yes, what we have to do is sort of accept that yes, some compliance is needed, but not that much. A lot of the regulation is redundant. A lot of the current roles are redundant because in the future, we're going to have to think seriously about true investment and particularly think about longer term investment, infrastructural investment, and the ways in which our value sets around each boardroom table or within each family, our value sets are going to determine how we state what that long-term objective is, what the purpose of the organization is. And we had quite a talk around this. And the cheery thing is at the end of it, they were quite cheerful. They decided, yeah, that actually is really what we've been trying to do. And this is true. They both have a good track record in trying to make these things happen. But the problem was, how do you then influence others to do it? And one of the things I was arguing with them about was that they keep saying we must change the regulation, we must influence the current players. And I was arguing that the issue is much bigger for future corporate governance. It's more a societal issue than a corporate issue. And until we begin to get the new determinants of the frame of that societal issue clear, then we're not going to get very far. And we had quite a long chat around that. What I was saying with two things. One is that I think not all of the next gen, but there's a general feeling in academia and in politics at the moment that there's not much we can do. We're partly doomed, which is what Rachel was just suggesting, that everything is relative. There's no serious deep values around at the moment. And that because of that, we'll be criticized, particularly on social media, if we say anything, because there'll be people who don't like that. And it's very easy to flip from just not liking something to hating people on media because you don't have any responsibility for what you say on it. So they were sort of puzzling around that. So I introduced them to the notion of social silence, which is a notion from anthropology. And what that says is in many societies, there are certain issues which are known by all sides, but to expose them to public gaze is so dangerous that it risks splitting that society. And I was arguing that the way we handle currently corporate governance is one of those social silence issues. Now, over the last year, particularly as the pandemic really took off, and particularly as people were, directors especially, were worrying about the future of their organization, I've had a large number of individual directors from many countries phone and say, Bob, can I have a quiet word with you? It's sort of unofficial mentoring. But the line was, look, we know that we've never been properly trained for our job. But we can't say that publicly for a number of reasons. But particularly at the moment, we can't say it publicly because it will destabilize society and it will expose us and our families to such horrible pressure from social media that we just keep our mouths shut. And I was arguing that, okay, fine, but you also have to realize, particularly if we talk about social silence, there are two parties involved. And the other party is the public. And it doesn't know what questions to ask about effective corporate governance. So the two parties keep quiet and try and rub along, but actually really can't stand each other in so many ways. And so the question for them, from me this morning was, how can we begin to expose these issues in such a way, in a way that allows mutual expression of the issues, mutual definition of the issues, so that we can actually begin to talk publicly about what we expect from our direction givers, but what our direction givers expect from the public as well. And that is where we're moving forward from that discussion this morning. So one of the things we then had a long talk about was trust, and this has come up during today a lot. The people and their trust of direction givers, and that's been queried in many of the sessions today. It came up particularly in the privacy versus the state argument we were looking at, especially in relation to blockchain, etc. Who trusts the state enough to really release so much data? And privacy versus our personal trust in others, and how we begin to not get into a negative mindset where I don't trust anybody, everybody's against us, or me rather. But how can we really begin to build much more a community activity? And I'm arguing that breaking the social silence, but in a gentle but persistent way, is, I think, a way forward. We are beginning to see a little movement on this through open discussion, but it's very, very quiet at the moment. But many of these people who are saying to me, Bob, as director, I really don't understand what's going on. And then second, I don't understand how I can reframe or even retrain myself to be able to do that. Seemed relieved to find that A, they weren't the only people in this mindset. B, that I don't know of anybody who can say exactly, I know precisely how we move forward at the moment. Because, for example, the environmental side, as Rachel has just said, has some metrics around it, but they're not particularly robust. The S side, the social side, is, I would argue, apart from some of the hard-edged HR elements, are all over the place at the moment. One of the things that's struck me a lot in the last month is people, when I've been having these sorts of discussions with them, talking about we need to go deeper on S and all the rest of it. And I've had critics of me and others on the phone or on the internet talking about how S has to be the future. But when I've asked a simple question, well, is defense now part of S? Long silences. And I would argue very strongly defense is part of S, particularly in the current circumstances, but not only that, because a key part of governance is defense of either the state or the organization. And unless we're very clear on how it is we're setting up the defense to ensure our organization or our nation has a healthy future, then we will fail, because D isn't part of our mindset. It's been a bit softy wimp, if you like, up until now. And it's suddenly got a harder edge to it, which a lot of people don't like very much. So we're beginning to work through that. But what I'm finding is that people are beginning to accept a notion that I'd put in a couple of my previous books, is that directing is a profession. Not normally accepted as such, because the way you get into directing, there seem to be three ways. One, you simply register at a national agency, pay a very small sum of money, you register a company, and then wham, you're a director. It's amazing. Well, this is obviously a nonsense. Two, you may be elected to that position, which is a rather more healthy one, or you may be selected, often by governmental or other, or by a venture capitalist or whoever, to go into that position. But on none of those occasions is there any notion that you should train, that you should be have basic assessment, basic knowledge, basic skills, basic attitudes or ethics to be able to do this job. And that's, I would argue, a big part of the social silence, is because we don't even know that amount. We keep quiet and we just hope we're not found out. But unfortunately, it's happening in the press all over the world at the moment. More and more people are being found out. And I'm not saying it's their fault. I'm saying they've been put into an impossible position. Because of the social silence, they can't admit the position they're in. But as soon as they're found out, that seems to be it. They have to go. And the whole thing is very, very unsatisfactory. So my challenge to the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute is, on top of the excellent work you've just done with this series and the excellent work you've done over the last 2 years, are you willing to begin gently to break the social silence? Are you beginning to actually say that directing is a proper job? I mean, if I was an airline pilot or a doctor and I just paid my £50, declared I was an airline pilot or a doctor, didn't have any qualifications, didn't have any training, nobody had assessed me, nobody had tested me, you'd be horrified. You'd be absolutely horrified. But I can say I'm a director, and it sounds grand, but it is a nonsense. So would the Institute be willing to begin to build, not make enormous public denunciations or anything else, but beginning to build towards the notion that they're facing the need to create a professional activity? I think that's the end of what I'm thinking at the moment.
Thank you so much, Professor Garratt. I really appreciate these, and I'm sure the audience does as well, the cutting edge, up to the minute, lens that you have shown us about what current directors are thinking, based on some of the issues that companies all over the world are facing at the moment. And I just wanted to, I don't often quote the Bible, but I just thought I would on this occasion. And this is from 1 Corinthians, and it says, moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. And then the other one from 1 Corinthians as well is, let no one seek his own good, rather, but the good of his neighbor. And I thought what you were saying, Professor Garratt, very, very instructive and quite along the same lines as those two passages. And, you know, really speaking to this concept of stewardship and what we've grown up with in the British common law system is a tradition of agency, corporate structures, because of by virtue of agency and being accountable to shareholders and executives acting on behalf of shareholders. By contrast, we are seeing more and more this concept of stewardship. And this, I think, relates directly to environmental and social governance and corporate governance generally. And I just wanted to perhaps take that point up and just get your reflections on are our corporate structures serving us well, and at this time, in times of crises particularly? And what do you think about, you know, how structures may be evolving, perhaps, or training directors may evolve the way our directors look at their roles and responsibilities?
I think our structures are pretty good, and they've been evolved over decades or even over a century. But it's this lack of the awareness that there's a process into which you have to be inducted and developed that is missing. But I would add a bit more. No, I won't add a bit more. I'll ask Peter Aylwin to add a bit more. Because Peter, if you look at your EES plus G model, do you want to say a bit more about that? Because I think that's where the whole notion of stewardship is suddenly much more diverse, much broader, and much richer. Peter.
Yeah, certainly, Bob. Thank you very much. Look, yeah, I think the key thing, why it is diverse, let's break it down from the granular level. You're talking about entrepreneurs that start with an idea where they feel that there's a gap in the marketplace where it can be profit driven. However, there's a huge need within the mindset and the hearts of the next generation to do good in doing so. And again, their mindset is as well, when they're working for a company now, what does the company stand for? Do they wish to be associated with it? I've just gone on online because Davos is on right now. I've got the option of actually flying in and having some meetings. It's the beauty of being in Europe; everything's so close together. But and there's a couple of views on just a great gathering of like Davos. A lot of people are going there just to meet other great high level people and see what good they can do with an open mind. And then you've got the others, which perhaps some believe they strongly have valid points. And also others, perhaps I think they're looking at it in the wrong perspective. But others are going there in protest of all these world leaders coming together and making what they think is making decisions on behalf of us without the mainstream having a say. But where we've explored this from an angle and more than ever is because the ultra high net worth and the family office community are direct. They are perfectly aligned. They can be a long-term investor. And if there is an alignment of values, but this is an industry, and to emphasize this, and Bob and I spoke about this off camera before, it is a highly trusted private network that is basically inaccessible to many people. In my opinion, it's just because of their perception and lack of knowledge on how to approach. There's a very, very intriguing example I heard involving the rich aristocrats of London and of course those that had money at one stage. But let's just say one that knows their way around the social circles of London as an aristocrat, they know their way around, so to speak. So there's a lot of these people that know their way around these circles, which could be great, they're trusted confidants. Some, of course, are perhaps not the ones you want to deal with there with the wheeler dealers. And then there are the others with the new ideas. And you've got the opportunities. And those are the ones that the families and the ultra net worth want to meet with directly. They don't really want to go through venture capitalists, private banks, Fund management, I couldn't agree more. And that model is, they don't want you to believe it's broken, but I could talk all day about more effective models on that. But the core thing is we are in that era of the virtual global citizen, and we're having a huge revamp of investment banking, financial planning, financial services. But again, it's becoming more streamlined and direct is the bottom line around that. As far as, of course, our EESG and where it all fits in, again, I'm repeating myself from a previous day, but I think for this separate group, it's applicable. I really see that we are on the cusp of what is going to be an enormously large alternative investment category of ESG or social impact. It's going to be labeled something, and it's going to be two ways. The GIN statistic says it's over 700 billion now, impact investing as a category. However, the governance and the definition of such is not yet confirmed. Social impact, in my opinion, is not boomed because the economic returns component has not been considered in alignment with, of course, proper and other non-ESG related investments. It has not necessarily been of the same caliber or same risk profile as the other alternatives. Because if you're looking at someone with $100 million or $1 billion, yeah, they'll give 1 or 2% to that impact investment that can lose money or make money because they believe in it, it's fun, etc. And it's like they can go to the gambling table on that one and feel good about it, that they've done good. But if you want that bulk of the capital or a greater proportion of that capital to go to true impact, then you're going to have to look at it and the economic returns plus entrepreneurship plus ESG. And that, I believe, once the framework, the governance is properly structured, you're going to see a twofold transition. One, you're just going to see these people taking it from one silo that's profit driven, because there's new governance and rules around what impact and ESG means. It's really, some of it's going to go from one basket to another, from private equity to now it's technically impact or impact private equity, from hedge fund to impact private hedge fund. I'm looking involved now in a lot of mining transactions, and a key component I look at, the first thing is the ESG, because you don't want to become part of a legacy project where they're using very, very questionable work practices. Number one. Number two, of course, if a lot of it is in developing markets, so you've got to see that the anti-money laundering, that the anti-bribery is there. And number three, of course, that they're integrated positively with the community. It's not just a situation where they're using dangerous chemicals and dangerous procedures. So we're seeing the revamps and the meanings of it come there. Some of it's just going to be a rebasketing of one silo from the next, and now we're an ESG company, and it's sexy to fund managers, of course, to say that. But then there's the others that are just legitimately going to cultivate that industry. And I think that's the twofold area where the actual family world needs help of governance practitioners like yourselves. And that's why this conference is so great, because the families are the initial investors that will see these initiatives from 1 to 5 to 10 million, maybe more. Some can put large checks, but the serious action is institutional, which will turn this into what I believe is a great vision as a starting point. In 10 to 15 years, what would happen if there were 5 million in debt and bonds and 5 million in equities and capital towards this new category of ESG/impact investment? Legitimate economic returns plus entrepreneurship plus ESG. To what degree would society benefit? Plus, at the same time, we're creating shareholder value. I leave you with that thought.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Peter. It's really such a interesting discussion around societal change and positive societal change as well, and what responsibility organizations bear in making that positive impact. When we talk about sustainability, we also essentially are talking about stability and stability of our societies. And I think Bob referenced it a little bit earlier around defense, because crises these days are having much more global impacts, and a crisis in a far-flung corner of the world can impact us in the Caribbean or anywhere else. And so the question of sustainability and stability for our societies, as well as transferring wealth both intergenerationally and in societies, are the issues that are coming to the fore. So thank you for that. That was very, very interesting. And I wanted to bring Rachel back into the conversation. I believe she is online.
Yeah, I'm right here.
There?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Rachel, I mean, you are an expert on ESG and advising companies on their ESG strategies. And how would you comment about where the Caribbean is in relation to developing, or the Caribbean corporations and organizations? Where are we in relation to developing our ESG strategies and having that transformational impact that we want to have in our society that Peter was just talking about? Where do you see us in that?
Well, I think it's difficult to speak about the Caribbean as a region because each country is so unique in what its challenges are from an ESG perspective, as well as what its marketplace looks like for business. Trinidad, for example, being a country that has relied heavily on its oil and gas economy for the best part of 100 years, is going to look very, very different to the economies that have been more based on tourism, for example. Why? Because the considerations that go into what they would determine to be their ESG strategy will be very different. So again, I will speak in generalisms, but bearing in mind, of course, that each context will be truly different. The conversation in the Caribbean around ESG is very, very nascent, because so far we remain in a conceptual discussion, and the feedback that I'm getting on the ground from businesses is, okay, we understand the importance and we want to get on this ESG journey, but we're not being given the practical tools to do so. And we don't yet know how we need to view our operations with this lens in order to start capturing what we need to capture to make significant change in this space. And I think there has not been much in terms of regulatory support or government interventions to facilitate companies embarking on their ESG journeys. And we have not particularly seen a very fast-paced private sector development of ESG consultation and support services. So part of what I'm embarking on here at Dantons Delaney is to start becoming pioneers in the professional services space to incorporate sustainability into everything that we do when we work with a client. Now, I think part of what needs to happen, other than sort of more practical discussions, is real understandings of opportunity. I think ESG is still viewed through the lens of being a cost. It's not fully understood as this future-proofing of your business for long-term gain. And again, I think context has been difficult here because the pandemic has caused businesses to struggle so significantly. The thought of being burdened by yet another requirement or another compliance piece or another piece in the puzzle to take up time, energy, and resource is something that is perceived to be quite daunting. The message I'm trying to send when talking to clients who have that view is take this as an opportunity to do what you were doing better. So we are not saying that ESG means you can no longer practice your business as you knew it. We're just asking you to add this lens of understanding your impact, measuring it, and attempting to behave more responsibly, progressively. There's also no overnight solution to ESG. So that's the other thing that needs to be communicated, is that there's this concept of ESG as being some sort of destination. You sort of become this sustainable company and you've kind of made it. And that is another myth to be debunked. You need to view your sustainable progress as that, as progress on a journey, not to say you shouldn't be doing all that you should be doing, but to say don't expect overnight results. And often, depending on the size of the company, it's a corporate cultural change. And that takes time.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned corporate culture, because I think that also is a great segue back into the values conversation. And it links also to not only the private wealth conversation around family office advice and how intergenerational wealth will, that legacy continues, but also corporate values and corporate the corporate values being the starting point. And really the values of an organization what defines how it does business. And so have you seen in your practice, have you seen the values piece being the starting point, or are you seeing the outputs being more of the objective?
Actually, in the companies that are endeavoring to make the largest commitments in this space, we are seeing very, very large commitments coming from the top, and then not much substance to flow. For example, making commitments on an international level to achieving certain things, while not really having structures in place internally to begin to address what those commitments would look like, or even what reporting on those commitments would look like. Now, I think the difficulty is, you know, a lot of these companies will be hearing, oh, you know, you have to lead from the top. So you need the board, you need the directors, you need the leadership to buy in. But when you just do that and you don't do anything else, and it doesn't filter down through your organization to those who are actually operating and getting them to understand what the culture change is supposed to look like or feel like or act like in the workplace, then, you know, you end up with what is an empty commitment. And, you know, I think there's a real need for companies to not only have the will and the desire, but also the persistence, because again, I see a lot of companies come hot and sweaty into wanting to get started, and then you start seeing everything dwindle. Resource, energy, time, you know, leadership time, you know, all of that just starts to wane. And that's exactly what will make your ESG strategy crumble.
Exactly. So having the right resources, not only the tone from the top, having the right resources devoted to these initiatives, making sure that they're through the organization. Every aspect of the business has sustainability elements and sustainability objectives. But I think this is such a great conversation because on the one hand, Professor Garratt is talking about, you know, the input and the wherewithal that directors have in order to set that tone. But then there's also that piece around implementation. And so what does successful implementation look like? Professor Garratt, have you, you know, in talking to your colleagues who are directors in international companies and so on, have you seen that same tension that we are seeing? They have said to you that, you know, they've recognized that they do need a little bit more training, but do you find that you have the real resources or those directors have the real resources and successful implementation strategies for ESG?
Well, two parts to that. The first one is it's more than a little bit more training. It's actually a change of mindset. Coming back to your Corinthians quote, you know, it's that stewardship thing that we are responsible for a total organization. But then I'll go beyond Corinthians or outside of Corinthians, say, and we have to ensure our health, but in a complex ecological external environment.
Yes.
And that's changing all the time. So it is actually a full-time job. I'm not saying you should be paid full-time or you should sit in an office full-time, but intellectually, this is a full-time job. It's 24/7. A piece of work that you're doing there. And that needs very different ways in learning how to think, how to process what is going on in the external environment in terms of politics, in terms of the physical environment, in terms of social change, technological change, etc., etc. That stuff. And a lot of my career in parallel has been with organizational change and development. And the one thing I know is that I have to work at the very bottom of the organization, however you want to put that in the nicest terms, but with the people who are really at the ground floor, really grafting, and talk to them about what would this mean to you? What would you see? And they normally come up with a whole range of amazing ideas instantly. So you won't believe the amount of waste we have around this organization, or you won't believe the stupid things we do, or the way we're structured, etc., etc. So it's a top down, but it's also very much a from the people upwards activity that's needed. And we have some very simple ways of recording that. So, but recording it anonymously so that the board and everybody in the organization can see the dimensions of the issues. We actually put some metrics around it so that they can look at the patterning of what's coming out. Now, you don't have to say who said what, but you can say, you know, these groups think this. And sometimes for virtually no resource, other than allowing them to have their own freedom to do something differently, you can actually make very significant changes in this area. And if that's based then on values that are around improving the physical environment, improving our relationships with the community, and thereby improving the governance of our own organization, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really important point, Professor Garratt, around empowering people to make those changes within the organization, so that they can make those changes that have sustainable impacts. Camille Facey from one of our directors at Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute has a comment here, and she says, in Jamaica, it's now becoming more accepted that our businesses must look both at economic return as well as ESG. The PSOJ, which I think is the Public Service Organization of Jamaica, recently had a session on how this would be done. So Camille, would you like to comment on that and a little bit more? And I'd like to invite you to share a little bit more on that, and then we can take it back to our panelists.
Thank you for the opportunity, Indu. And it's a private sector organization of Jamaica.
Oh, private, sorry. Yes, sorry.
Right.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. So I think in Jamaica, we are now beginning to grapple with this. But what makes me hopeful is that it's being acknowledged that this is an economic imperative. So when we look at case studies like BP, where they ended up having all these fines because they did not listen to their whistleblowers who told them that they were going to have a calamity and how much it cost them in the long run, and how much, say, a BP has transformed, or it appears to us looking at their annual reports, because they have now better embedded ESG practices. We find that our people here are coming on board, or boards are saying, yes, what do we need to do? And so the guidance now that it's being looked for and given through organizations like the PSOJ is these are the steps. Citibank also recently had seminars because they're looking to fund these sorts of transformations, and we have PwC doing work here. But if I may also crave your indulgence to deal with a point that Professor Garratt mentioned about the directorship being a proper job. Prof, I have taken the liberty of quoting your section from your book on the 24/7 director and reading it to directors.
Thank you.
After I read that, there is silence. But move, because nobody quite understood that this was their role. And when we talk about agency versus fiduciary responsibility, the reality is that an agent is supposed to exhibit those same fiduciary responsibilities because they are a fiduciary. But I will close with one thing. So I also read your quote to some senior public sector persons. And they said, Camille, speak very quietly, because we are not able to afford to pay people at the level that what you are describing would involve. So where we are in Jamaica now on the public sector is we are telling people they have fiduciary responsibilities. We are training them, but I don't know when that compensation is going to kick in. But in the meantime, we're letting them know that if you take this job, this is what you are signing up for.
Yeah, thank you, Camille. Thank you for that. It seems that, you know, the private sector organization of Jamaica is really making some strong impact, some great strides in this area, and we can perhaps learn a lot from your organization as well in Jamaica. You mentioned a large corporation as well, and I wanted to just talk a little bit about greenwashing and what that means, what the term greenwashing means, and what are your thoughts, our panelists, Professor Garratt and Rachel, on this concept of greenwashing? I think, Professor Garratt, you mentioned how vulnerable companies and individuals are to social media, and sometimes the initiatives of large corporations or private individuals are subject to criticism on the basis of greenwashing. And how is that being reconciled? How are some of the organizations that you're in touch with, how are they dealing with that?
May I'll come back to that, but may I ask Rachel, because she had it on her slides first,
Yes.
if you start with your experiences and then I'll sing the choruses.
Of course, sure.
I think here in the Caribbean, we've benefited greatly from not being a particularly litigious society. I am a hawkeye for these things, and I have seen many instances where terminology is used to describe something. For example, the term green.
Yes.
Being bandied about to say, oh, what we're doing is green, or this is a green initiative. And I think ESG provides a real solution to that. If you market what you're doing as part of your ESG journey, you're not slapping a label on it. Again, it's this idea of a journey, not a destination. If you are a bank and you start a fund and you call it a green fund, what is the criteria for obtaining access to that funding? I could want to bring a suite of electric vehicles in to replace every car in Trinidad. And guess what? Those will still be built on the back of fossil fuels. That's where we are as a society. So it's not green, right? So I probably shouldn't qualify for your funding. So again, we're setting unrealistic expectations on things when we slap on labels like green and environmentally friendly, because I'm sorry, unless you're holding hands with an animal or something, I don't know what environmentally friendly really means. You need to look at everything on the basis of impact. Am I having a net positive impact? And it has to be looked at as a net. So I think, again, I think a lot of what happens in this region is not malicious greenwashing. It's not intentional. It's not an attempt to defraud. It's a real misunderstanding of some of the terminology that gets thrown about, like buzzwords, that again, social media kind of normalizes the use of some of these terms and make them seem less consequential than they are. But again, this region is benefiting from a lack of regulation in this space. So there is no legal definition as to what these things mean if they're used. So it's unlikely that we will see a wave of greenwashing litigation surge in the Caribbean. But that being said, I think what we are seeing is a desperate need to educate. Companies need to understand what they're saying when they make certain declarations as to the nature of their operations, but I rarely think, and I pitch this all the time to my clients, it is a real solution to your problems, marketing problems, that is, and your public relations problems, for you to couch everything as part of your ESG strategy and your ESG journey. We are working towards becoming a sustainable business. We are, as opposed to saying we are a sustainable business because we've done away with plastic bottles or something like that, in which case people can then point to all other aspects of your operations and say, but what about this? But what about that? And, the greenwashing arena is when we get into the world of absolutes and we get to the world of destination labeling. And ESG is really a solution to that when you do it properly.
Yes, I really appreciate those comments, Rachel, because it can't be ad hoc and it can't be labeling. It's got to really run through. And that's sort of ties into some of the comments you made earlier around running your ESG initiatives throughout your organizations, through every aspect. So Bob, your comments as well?
Well, I pick up the point on absolutes and destination labeling.
Yeah.
About 10 years ago or so, I had the weird experience of working simultaneously with two boards. One was the board of Greenpeace International, and the other was the main board of Shell.
Mm-hmm.
And we were trying to sort out the end of the enormous problems that have been created by Greenpeace getting on those oil rigs. Great television, wonderful television. and then announcing that Shell were going to pollute Norwegian fjords by sinking the old rigs into them, etc., etc. Now, what was happening behind the scenes was absolutely riveting to me. It was the fact that Greenpeace were delighted with their PR, but were hiding a huge secret.
Mm-hmm.
And the secret was the people who got onto the rigs and took the samples of the pollution actually didn't. They took samples of the diesel oil tank that was on board for a subsidiary motor, which was highly polluting. But the actual stuff that was the stuff that was on board the rig itself would have been able to help, believe it or not, the biology of the part of the fjords in which they were going to be sunk. So there was then a complete standoff in PR terms, and Shell lost that dramatically. So they were then forced to chop it all up, take it out to the Marianas Trench, sink it there, where they now have definitive proof that it really helped the biology of the Marianas. So they've been able to track it over 10 years. So back to the absolutes and the shouting that goes on at the time. Similarly, with BP, with this, it was dreadful, the pollution in the Bay of Mexico. That was appalling, and that was a very interesting example in my life of the way in which two organizational cultures were not merged effectively.
Right.
So the American culture carried on in a fairly Wild West way, whereas the Brits were trying to do the right thing, but didn't really take the Americans in hand once they'd taken over their organization. And there was a dreadful accident, it polluted everything. But BP, being essentially a science-based organization, it too tracked over a period of 12, 13 years now, is it? What was going on with the pollution. Yes, it killed some people in the accident. Yes, it polluted quite a lot of the shoreline. But what they found was the amount of pollution on the shoreline was considerably less than the amount of pollution from US submarines and merchant ships sunk in the Second World War on the same shoreline.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all a matter of time and PR and a lot of greenwashing. I come back to Rachel's earlier point, is very much around virtue signaling, which I think is always intensely dangerous for a board. It's better to actually quietly get on, sort the science out and get it right than to immediately set your PR department on virtue signaling, in which case you'll almost certainly be found out through social media very rapidly indeed. And you're then in dead trouble.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point as well, Professor Garratt, around the communication and, the I suppose, integration and, what in terms of the output, in terms of communication from organizations and how that really reflects the values as well as the processes and the whole sustainability initiatives. We do have a comment from Dorit, I think, Dory Ann Beckles, and she says, maybe in the interim, one could address the lacuna in directors' fees with indemnity provisions that would give directors a sense of comfort about holding directors' positions. So any comments there? And after this last comment from Dorit, I would open the floor to anybody else who has a comment or a question. And then we can have final comments from you, Professor Garratt, and from you, Rachel, as well.
I would respond to the question by saying, I don't think that's much comfort. I've very rarely seen articles of association of a company that do not indemnify directors. Directors are pretty much by nature indemnified. I think certainly in the UK, standard articles of incorporation that are handed to you as a business, if you don't want to draft your own, will contain a director's indemnity. The question as to fees, it goes back to what Camille, I believe, was saying, is this notion of, look how much we are now responsible. Look at all of this, that we're having to do. Look at this long list of things that are now our responsibility. And I would be surprised if the indemnity were enough comfort for that. I think what Camille is saying is still remains sort of the valid problem.
I would be amazed if it gave any comfort at all, because most indemnity policies I know indemnify the director only against the legal costs of any cases brought against them. Mm-hmm. And if you get if you've done something wrong and that is proven, then you're not indemnified.
Right.
So it's a very slim. I absolutely with Rachel on that. It's a very slim position of comfort. You could argue we're all mad to be directors in the first place, because none of us are indemnified, none of us are paid properly, and I see it as part of our giving back to society in becoming a director. But that's a weird position from the financial point of view, from the finance industry point of view. But most others I know think it is part of their social duty.
Yeah. Yes, very true. I'd just like to open the floor, and then we can have some closing comments. Does anyone have anything they would like to raise and put to the panelists? If not, I have one further question, one final question, and then we could go to closing comments. Okay, I attended this session this morning. I think we all did, Rachel and Bob. And one of the things Tom Handler mentioned, who is this very experienced lawyer in the area of private wealth management and intergenerational transition. One of the things that he mentioned and was commenting about was the opportunity for us as a Caribbean region to explore and take advantage of philanthropy or philanthropic investment from privately held wealth. And one of the things that occurred to me was, from a governance point of view, from a societal point of view, we could well benefit from social investment from privately held philanthropy. Rachel, would you like to comment on perhaps some of the things that we could do from a policy perspective, based on your knowledge of our corporate structures in Trinidad and in the region? Are there any things that maybe stand out for you in terms of policy that would help us along the way of accessing that philanthropic wealth for the benefit of our societies and the sustainability of our societies?
Yeah, I think sort of where the direction of philanthropic money tends to follow the sort of attention of the public, as well as the direction of sort of governance. So you need a collaborative approach to get that to become where we are. We need government to get on board and start mentioning this. We need education in this region in a big way around what sustainability means. To this day, we haven't, at least in Trinidad, I can't speak for every other island, we have not embedded any aspect truly of sustainability into our educational system. We're not raising our children to be very aware of these issues. Fortunately, we all have smartphones, and ESG now has trendy TikToks and whatever that will get people's attention. But we as a society need to do better in instilling in our public, our general public, a sense of the importance of why responsible business is important, why responsible business is essential. Philanthropic money, private wealth philanthropic money in the Caribbean, I wouldn't say should be the biggest focus for us. I think corporate philanthropic money, so private sector philanthropic money, tends to be a little more voluminous and forthcoming. That we are working on very actively. Actually, just last year, the UN Resident Coordinator's Office here in Trinidad and Tobago ran a session that was dedicated to multinational foundations, i.e. multinational companies that are established in Trinidad and Tobago and have a philanthropic arm that gives back to society, for them to start measuring their impact from an ESG lens, for them to start quantifying, measuring, reporting, disclosing the impact they are having in our society, not from a dollars and cents perspective, but from a measure of what the outcomes are for the environment, for our society, and for governance. And, that was a new approach. Everyone in the room sort of took a little gasp, because that isn't how we tend to do things in our philanthropy. So again, there is a lot of opportunity, I think, that needs to stem from a better understanding and awareness in our society. And I also believe that Trinidad society in particular, but the Caribbean in general, would benefit from more involvement from civic society, more public involvement in holding companies and government to account.
Well, I think Peter did mention there was, about $700 billion in impact investing that's kind of on the table. So whether we call it corporate investment or private wealth investment, there is a potential pool of impact investing that's available to us, right? So, but thank you for that. And Professor Garratt, I'll leave it to you to comment there and then invite you to give your closing remarks.
Well, I don't know enough about the Caribbean to really comment. I think Rachel has commented very well on that. I'll leave it there. So my closing remarks will be going back to the conversation I had this morning with these two very senior directors. We agreed in the end, and I mentioned this in the last session I did last week, but we agreed to pick up the sessions I had had immediately before COVID and immediately after COVID, so a couple of months ago, in the Houses of Parliament, where the all-party group on corporate governance, so this is a volunteer group, it's not an official grouping, of peers and MPs, can come together, have a decent lunch, and then have to listen to people like me going on about corporate governance. And they, for the most part, they stayed awake, but I was really giving them a tough time and did on both occasions. And I think I mentioned what I did was just say to them, of the people in the room, you passed this legislation, you passed it in 2006. So how many of you can tell me of the 7 duties of director, can anybody give me 3? Utter silence. And then the decent thing was on both occasions afterwards, sort of 4, 5, 6 of them came forward and said, this is hugely embarrassing. You're right, we pass this legislation. There is no way in which anybody tells us what it is, what it means, what we should be doing to monitor it ourselves. And on both occasions, all of the people who came to see me had not been in Parliament at that time, or even 10 years later. So I come back to the point that I think the Institute and the other associations that have a vested interest in this, and they should have a vested interest in that, need to open up part of this social silence bit to begin to actually educate not just directors, but the legislators particularly, to understand what it is they either have done or are doing. And it's not only in my own country. I've had this conversation in a number of countries now. It was interesting to me when I first came to Trinidad, which must be about 9 years ago, and I was giving a little chat that seemed to go on quite well through the afternoon and early evening, and then we had a very rumbustious dinner afterwards, which was great. And during that dinner, I had a message from the British ambassador, no, sorry, the British High Commissioner, saying, would you mind staying on, don't go to the airport tomorrow morning, stay on. If you're happy, I'll arrange a flight out in the evening back to Barbados, and we'll pay you to stay your hotel bill. But I'd like you to meet a few people in the morning and give a little synopsis of what you've been saying this evening. So I said, okay, and we went to a discreet room in a hotel, and there was the governor of the central bank, the head of the Transparency Commission, and the central bank governor, the head of the stock exchange. And they said, would you mind saying what you said the afternoon before, which I did. I got halfway through that to coffee time, at which point they said, would you mind just waiting a few minutes? Just take a seat to the side. The three of us need to talk to each other. This is rather serious. And they spoke to each other in very serious tones about what had been said until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, at which point I had to leave for the airport. But it was very interesting that, to me, that they had never really sat down together. But part of the conversation I could overhear, and by the way, all these people are now not in post, part of the conversation I could hear was, how on earth do we tell this to the politicians? And I think that's where we are at the moment. How do we do that?
Yeah.
So that's it.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that. It really underscores the 2 points you were making about social silence. That point you made, Professor Garratt, and breaking that social silence. And then the point you made, Rachel, about education and civil society engagement and civil society activism as well coming to the fore. So I'll invite you, Rachel, just to share your closing remarks, and then I'll hand back to Kamla so that she can close the session. Thank you both very much appreciated.
Thank you, Indu. My closing remarks will be very brief. I just want to encourage every participant to have conversations at work, have conversations in friendship groups, have conversations wherever you have a platform to do so around what responsible business looks like, feels like, acts like, getting an understanding of that low-hanging fruit. At the end of the day, the investment that's going to be possible for a future generation is based on the systems we put in place now. So right now we have the opportunity, should I say privilege, to change the way things are being done systemically to allow an opportunity for a much brighter future. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. All the best.